The War of 1812. January 1813. The war thus far. On January the 12th, or the 19th, depending on your source, William Jones, a successful Philadelphia businessman, former congressman, and Revolutionary War veteran, and member of the American Philosophical Society, becomes Secretary of the Navy, replacing Paul Hamilton. According to his entry on Wikipedia, quote, his policies contributed greatly to American success on the Great Lakes and to a strategy of coastal defense and commerce raiding on the high seas. In late 1814, near the end of his term, he made recommendations on the reorganization of the Navy Department. End of quote. My knowledge of the war is not sufficient to allow me to comment on that in any detail, but it's generally accepted that the U.S. Navy performed well during the conflict. Much better than the U.S. Army. From January 18th through to the 23rd occur a series of events that Pierre Berton describes as the tragedy of the raisin. On January the 10th, an American force under Brigadier General James Winchester arrives at the Maumee Rapids near present-day Perrysburg, Ohio. As noted in my October 1812 video, Winchester was supposed to command the Army of the Northwest, but was pushed aside when William Henry Harrison was made a Major General of the Kentucky Militia, then a Major General in the regular U.S. Army. Winchester agrees to serve under Harrison and commands one wing of Harrison's forces. If Pierre Berton is correct in his observation, and I have no reason to doubt him, Winchester is extremely unpopular with the troops, especially with the Kentucky militia. According to Berton, Winchester considers resigning upon learning of his replacement by Harrison, but instead decides to serve on. I think his first idea was actually the best one. On January the 13th, two residents of nearby Frenchtown, present-day Monroe, Michigan, bring a message to Winchester's headquarters from Cecil Day, an American settler and trader living in the village. In the note, Day estimates that 500 Americans could take and hold the village. Over the next few days, several more messengers will arrive, claiming the British intend to burn the settlement, which they are defending with only 2 companies of Canadian militia and 200 native warriors. After a council of war, Winchester agrees to send 500 men under Lieutenant Colonel William Lewis, as he believes he will soon be reinforced by Harrison's troops. But, as Sandy Antal notes in his book, A Wampum Denied, Proctor's War of 1812, this plan is not without risk. While Frenchtown was only 35 miles from the Maumee Rapids, it was also only 18 miles from Fort Malden/Emmitsburg, inviting a British counterattack. The U.S. troops depart on January the 17th, advancing 18 miles to spend the night at Presque-Isle, present-day Toledo, Ohio, and the following day, determined to get to Frenchtown before the British can reinforce it, they marched over the lake ice to arrive at the settlement at around 3 in the afternoon. An American charge drives the 2nd Essex Regiment and their Potawatomi and Wyandot allies from the village. But the Canadians and the native warriors retreat in good order and inflict serious casualties. Antel reports 12 Americans killed and 55 wounded. Still, the Americans are elated with their victory, and Winchester hastens to the settlement with 250 regulars, plus a herd of cattle and 200 hogs. We shall be hearing more about these hogs shortly. But once ensconced in Frenchtown, Winchester fails to secure the village and erect defensive barriers, believing, erroneously, that it is too cold for the British to attack. Warren's Maxim of War, number 609. It is never too cold for an enemy to mount an attack. Meanwhile, at Fort Malden, British Colonel Henry Proctor has been busy. On learning of the seizure of Frenchtown, he began making plans to dislodge the Americans before Harrison can reinforce Winchester's forces. Channeling his best Isaac Brock, Proctor strips the fort's defenses and hurriedly assembles a force of around 1,200 men, including 336 regulars, 212 militiamen from the 1st and 2nd Essex regiments, and 500 native warriors under Roundhead, Splitlog, and Walk on the Water. Proctor's force arrives at Frenchtown at dawn and advance towards the village undetected. They are just about to charge the settlement when American drummers sound reveille, and they are spotted by an American sentry who fires on them, rousing the U.S. camp. The British assault is initially stymied with heavy casualties, but the native warriors manage to turn the right flank of the American line, forcing the U.S. troops to fall back, their retreat turning into a rout in which many were killed or captured. And among the captured was General Winchester, the general's 16-year-old son, and Lieutenant Colonel William Lewis. Winchester surrenders. Meanwhile, a group of Kentucky militiamen under Major George Madison, no relation to President James Madison, I think, hiding behind the picket fencing that sheltered the village, were holding their own and inflicting serious damage to the attacking British. But they were now down to 2 to 3 cartridges per man. Madison, who believes that Winchester's order to surrender is not binding on him, as the general is a prisoner, wants terms, causing Proctor to snap, "Do you mean to dictate to me?" To which Madison replies, "I mean to dictate for myself, and we prefer selling our lives as dearly as possible, rather than be murdered in cold blood." The militiamen are clearly worried they will be killed by the native warriors if they surrender. In view of what happened next, accounts as to the terms of surrender vary, but in any event, the Kentucky men lay down their arms at 11 a.m. Now, General Winchester had been captured by a native warrior named Brandy Jack, who turned him over to Roundhead, a Wyandot chief. Roundhead stripped Winchester of his hat, his coat, and his sword before daubing his skin with paint and presenting him to Proctor, who has trouble convincing the warrior to return the garments. It is but one more humiliation for Winchester, who, according to Pierre Burton, was the victim of numerous practical jokes at the hands of his wild Kentucky militiamen. Pxhere fears an immediate attack by the Americans. He has heard a false rumor that Harrison and his men are only 8 miles away, and so he departed for Fort Malden on the afternoon of the 22nd, leaving behind 64 seriously wounded American prisoners, which sets the scene for tragedy. Pxhere believes he has no choice. With over 500 American prisoners and his own wounded, he is in no condition to fight Harrison's fresh troops. In fact, he probably believed that Harrison would soon be in Frenchtown and would take charge of the American wounded. The wounded Americans were under the care of 2 surgeons plus some attendants, but the British on site appear to have been gone when 200 native warriors arrived on the morning of the 23rd. After robbing the wounded of their clothing and killing those unable to move, the warriors set fire to the 2 houses which had been serving as hospitals, and then marched those still alive into captivity, murdering those who could not keep up. In a macabre note, the hogs which Winchester ordered to Frenchtown were observed to be dining on some of the unburied dead. Gosh, that's enough to put you off your bacon. The massacre at Frenchtown became a national outrage in the U.S., which adopted the battle cry, "Remember the raisin! Remember the raisin!" Henry Pxhere was blamed for the slaughter of the wounded, but the British believed the native atrocities were revenge for atrocities committed by the Kentucky militiamen. Personally, I think Pxhere did believe that Harrison was on the march, and his arrival would save the American prisoners. The final butcher's bill? Wikipedia lists the following figures: British/Canadian/Native allies, 40 dead, 162 wounded, and 3 captured. American, 410 dead, 94 wounded, and 547 captured, 30 to 100 of those being killed in the ensuing massacre. Pxhere's defeat of Winchester's forces was, according to Sandy Antal, quote, "one of the most complete of any in the war, having wiped out the fighting corps of the Northwest Army. He had effectively foiled Harrison's winter offensive." End of quote. Thus, 1813 dawns with a stalled American offensive, and, to quote the title of Sandy Antel's chapter on Frenchtown, "with blood and ice, the War of 1812 is about to get a whole lot nastier." If this is your first visit to 1812 channel, my name is Warren and I'm your host. I'm not a historian, nor am I an expert on the War of 1812. Instead, I'm a student wishing to learn about the conflict. Each month for the roughly 3 years of the war, I will outline the major events. I will also review a book about the war. Did I miss anything? Any errors? Then let me know in the comments below. When the barrage lifts, cheers! Warren here. Just a quick note. I wish to apologize for my slow uploading on this channel. I still haven't posted October's book review, and it's January. Yikes. I must admit that I find the research and writing for 1812 channel to be very challenging and time-consuming. But I'm committed to what a friend calls the 1812 project, and I intend to Soldier on. I hope you will march in step with me. Cheers. Pictures used in today's video, courtesy of Pxhere, and they show winter scenes similar to those that the British, Canadian, and American soldiers would have seen during the Battle of Frenchtown. The last picture, though, actually shows some cannon at Fort George in Niagara-on-the-Lake, where I once worked as a security guard many, 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 many years ago. Oh, and the music? It's Oppressive Gloom by that patron of the internet, Kevin MacLeod. I thought it was appropriate for a story about cousins killing cousins. When the barrage lifts, till then, keep your head down. The War of 1812, February 1813. The war thus far. On February the 5th, Major General John Armstrong becomes the new U.S. Secretary of War, replacing William Useless. William Eustace. Armstrong has a solid military background. Prior to his appointment, he advocated concentrating U.S. forces against Montreal, the capture of which would starve Upper Canada out of the war. But once in office, however, he switches strategy to concentrate on attacks against Emmitsburg, Kingston, and Fort George and Fort York. 2 days after Armstrong takes up his new post, the Americans cross the St. Lawrence to raid Elizabethtown, Upper Canada, now Brockville, Ontario. The hero, or villain of the piece, depending on which side you're on, is Major Benjamin Forsyth of the U.S. Rifle Regiment, who in September 1812 led a successful cross-border raid against Gananoque, Upper Canada. See my September 1812 video where the raid is discussed. On February 7th, Forsyth left his current base in Ogdensburg, New York with 200 men, both regulars and militia, traveling 12 miles by sleigh to Morristown, New York, where they crossed the frozen St. Lawrence to Elizabethtown, which they took by surprise. Resistance was minimal, with 1 American and 1 British casualty. The U.S. will take 52 British prisoners, release 16 Americans held in the local jail, and liberate both stores and weapons before setting fire to the barracks and returning to Ogdensburg. While the raid provides a rare American victory, it is not pleasing to the local population, who have an unofficial truce with their Canadian neighbors, and they are afraid of retaliation, which comes swiftly. The British commander at Prescott, near Elizabethtown, and across the St. Lawrence from Ogdensburg, is an aggressive and prickly officer, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Pearson of the 23rd Regiment. Pearson wants to retaliate against Forsyth by raiding Ogdensburg, but is restrained by the defensive policies of his commander, Sir George Prevost. On February the 21st, Sir George himself makes a surprise appearance at Prescott on his way westward down the St. Lawrence to York to, as author Richard Feltow puts it, quote, to quell the growing criticism of General Scheiff's administration of Upper Canada, End of quote. But that's a story for another time. Sir George puts an end to Pearson's ideas regarding Ogdensburg by transferring him to be the commanding officer at Kingston, effective immediately, and by ordering Pearson to leave with Sir George's party early the next morning. To replace Pearson, Sir George appoints Major Red George MacDonald of the Glengarry Light Infantry, a company formed from the largely Catholic settlers of the Glengarry district of Upper Canada. To cover the movements of his party, Sir George orders Red George to drill the troops on the frozen waters of the St. Lawrence as a diversion against attack. And here's where things start to get interesting. What is it they say? If you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. The American sentries are so used to seeing their opponents drilling on the ice, they pay no attention to them. Besides, it's really cold out. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Warren's Maxim of War, number 609. It is never too cold for an enemy to mount an attack. And as the boss is away, happily slain, as in riding in a sleigh, happily slain westwards, Red George decides it's time for the troops to play. Rough! Forming his men into two columns, he charges across the frozen river, hoping to take his enemy by surprise. He does. The main column encounters little opposition and is able to gain the village, but the right column, under Captain John Jenkins, has the misfortune of running into Forsyth's men, who, backed by artillery, inflict serious casualties, including Jenkins, who loses an arm to grape shot. The right column withdraws, but regroups and returns to the attack. Red George's force soon has control of the village, and Forsyth and his men are forced to retreat to Sackett's Harbor, leaving behind their wounded and a considerable amount of plunder, arms, ammunition, and supplies. So much stuff, in fact, that it takes most of the day for the victors to trundle it back across the ice to Prescott. Naturally, there is looting, although the British officers take pains to restrain their men and to return stolen property. Author Richard Feltow provides the following amusing quote. In an interesting sidebar to this event, there are also strong indications that some of the women from Prescott took advantage of the British victory to engage in what today might be colloquially termed a five-finger discount cross-border shopping expedition, as a number were subsequently witnessed returning across the river to Prescott during the course of the following day, bearing various size bundles of items. End of quote. In writing his report on the successful raid, Red George follows the "it's better to ask forgiveness than permission" strategy, but Sir George has the last laugh when he claims credit for having ordered the raid. Wikipedia lists the casualty figures as follows. British/Canadian, 6 killed, 44 wounded. American, 20 killed, 6 wounded, 70 captured. Richard Feltow has slightly different figures. British/Canadian, 8 killed, 32 wounded. American, killed 20 to 26, wounded and captured 74. You might think the raid would end the cozy cross-border relationship between the peoples of Pembroke and Ogdensburg, but you'd be wrong. The folks on the American side blame the raid and their losses not on their British friends, but on Forsyth and his men for having stirred things up. For the rest of the war, there will be no more military operations in this sector of the St. Lawrence front, and the good people on the New York side will soon be, once again, happily trading with the enemy. A good account of these cross-border, might I say, treasonous activities can be found in The Civil War of 1812 by Alan Taylor, a book I am currently enjoying. On February 16th begins the epic trek of the 104th Regiment of Foot, aka the New Brunswick Fencibles. They will be marching through the snowdrifts from Fredericton, New Brunswick, to Kingston in modern-day Ontario. And yes, you heard that right. A distance of 500 miles. All right, 494.41 miles. Hey, I looked it up. But according to Pierre Burton, the troops actually walk some 700 miles through snow, ice, and biting winds, arriving at Kingston after an epic march of 52 days. 52 days without losing a single man. Wow. Just wow. Burton thinks this changes the course of the war. Quote, "This remarkable trek has helped to tip the scales of war. Directly across the lake at Sackett's Harbor, an American army poised to invade Canada waits for the ice to break. Its target was Kingston. But now, with reinforcements pouring in, their numbers blown out of all proportion by rumor, that target has been changed. The Americans will attack York instead. The lifeline that links the two Canadas will not be severed." End of quote. Personally, I'm not so sure it changes the course of the war. But what do you think, dear listeners? We'll end the month by traveling all the way down to the Demerara River in Guyana, where the USS sloop of war, USS Hornet, encounters the cruiser-class brig sloop HMS Peacock. In the words of Wikipedia, quote, "After an exchange of broadsides, Hornet was able to rake Peacock, forcing her to strike. Peacock was so badly damaged that she sank shortly after surrendering." End of quote. The Hornet, under command of James Lawrence, he of Don't Give Up the Ship fame, is on a sortie with the USS Constitution, having left Boston on October the 26th, 1812, and eventually arriving off the coast of South America, where they split up. On February 24th, the Hornet had pursued a British merchant vessel to the mouth of the Demerara River, where they also found HMS Pxhere, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, at anchor, while HMS Peacock was approaching from the sea. The two ships fire broadsides at each other from close range, but the American ship is better armed, 32-pound carronades versus 24-pound carronades, and the American fire is more accurate. After the death of Captain William Peake, the Peacock surrendered, but it sank so quickly that some of its crew, and some of the Americans who had boarded her, were drowned. Wikipedia lists the casualties as follows: British, 17 killed, 33 wounded, 3 mortally. American, 5 killed, 4 wounded, 1 mortally. The USS Constitution Museum gives the following figures for the engagement. British, Commander William Peake, 130 men, 20 guns, 14 killed, 33 wounded. American, Master Commandant James Lawrence, 170 men, 20 guns, 4 killed, 4 wounded. Thus, February sees the appointment of a new and improved U.S. Secretary of War. Maybe. Raids across the St. Lawrence, an epic march of 700 miles, and naval action off the coast of South America. Who says this is a small-scale war? The War of 1812. March 1813. The war thus far. March 1813 will see a lot of action at sea. You know, the other area of conflict in the War of 1812? Early in March, the USS Essex, a sailing frigate originally built in 1799 and a veteran of the Quasi-War and the First Barbary War, sails around Cape Horn. Cape Horn, at the base of South America. Cape Horn, the place where the Atlantic meets the Pacific. Its objective? To disrupt the British whaling fleet. The ship will anchor at Valparaiso, Chile, on March the 14th, having captured the British whaling schooner Elizabeth and the Narida, a Peruvian man of war. Hey, who says the War of 1812 ain't international? The U.S. skipper, David Porter, will send a disarmed Narida back to the Peruvians as a gesture of goodwill. But, looking ahead, on March the 28th, 1814, the Essex itself will be captured by HMS Phoebe and HMS Cherub during the Battle of Valparaiso and will then be pressed into British service, where she will remain until 1837. On March 3rd, Admiral George Cockburn, who will help burn Washington, arrives at Lynnhaven Bay near Chesapeake Bay. He will be second in command of the North American station under Sir John Warren. The Wikipedia article about Cockburn notes, quote, "He went on to be the first naval lord, and in that capacity sought to improve the standards of gunnery in the fleet, forming a gunnery school at Portsmouth. Later, he ensured that the Navy had the latest steam and screw technology and put emphasis on the ability to manage seamen without the need to resort to physical punishment." End of quote. Cockburn wants to teach the Americans a lesson. He will. Sticking with the Royal Navy, on March the 19th, Sir James Lucas Yeo, a captain with extensive combat experience, is appointed Commodore of the fleet on Lake Ontario, headquartering in Kingston. Yeo will hold his command until the war's end. Most accounts of Captain Yeo are positive, but my initial impression of him was a negative one, due to his failure to support General Proctor and Captain Barclay in their struggles on Lake Erie, and for his role in the court-martial of General Prevost, events outlined in Sandy Antell's book, A Wampum Denied, Proctor's War of 1812, events we will be covering in the future. But if you have a better opinion of Yeo, please share your reasons in the comments below. Hey, that rhymes. But whilst Yeo is getting settled, south of him, on Lake Erie, Oliver Hazard Perry, in command of American naval forces on Lake Erie, arrives at Presqu'Isle Bay, Erie, Pennsylvania, on March the 27th. According to Sandy Antell, quote, "On 27 March, Master Commandant Oliver Hazard Perry, USN, arrived to take command, finding 3 gunboats on the stocks and the keels of 2 20-gun brigs laid down. Surprisingly, the high command in the Canadas expressed no concern over these developments. While Procter prepared to break up Harrison's preparations in Ohio, the menacing naval presence to his rear steadily grew. End of quote. The Wikipedia timeline for the War of 1812 claims that by March the 30th, 1813, the Royal Navy will be blockading the U.S. coastline from Long Island to the Mississippi, i.e., to New Orleans. I'm not sure the coverage is that extensive by this date, but it is clear that from this point in the war, British strategy will be to keep the American Navy and American privateers bottled up in port. Thus ends March 1813, a month of action on the water. But what's happening on land? Or, more specifically, on the ice? By March the 30th, William Henry Harrison's Army of the Northwest has been reduced to around 2,000 men. The general himself leaves the front, for home, I guess, on March the 7th, but not before one final attempt to get at the enemy. On March the 2nd, Harrison dispatches Captain Angus Langham of the 19th U.S. Infantry Regiment with a force of 68 regulars, 120 Pennsylvania and Virginia militiamen, and 24 native warriors. Their objective? To cross the frozen ice of Lake Erie from the Maumee Rapids to Amherstburg, Upper Canada, where they are to blow up the vessel Queen Charlotte, currently frozen in place. Langham's force leaves on some 30 sleds, but things quickly unravel due to disciplinary problems, which include drunkenness, men refusing to continue, and one sled falling through thin ice. Eventually, they find their road to Canada blocked by open water and abort this abortion of a mission. An aside, I find it amazing that Lake Erie would freeze enough to allow troops to move across it. Maybe climate change is real. But even as this comic opera is playing itself out on Lake Erie, on Lake Ontario, an American invasion fleet is being assembled. Objective Toronto. All right, Objective York. Stay tuned. The War of 1812. April 1813. The war thus far. On April the 1st, Prussia officially enters the war on the side of the Canadians. April Fools. The Wikipedia timeline for the War of 1812 notes that April sees the British commence commerce raiding in the Chesapeake Bay, which Wikipedia says is the largest estuary in the United States. Estuary, quote, a partially enclosed coastal body of brackish water with one or more rivers or streams flowing into it and with a free connection to the open sea. End of quote. According to the Wikipedia article on the bay, British naval forces under command of Admiral George Cockburn, operating from a base on Tangier Island, will treat the bay as a British lake, raiding American towns along the shore with impunity. As an aside, I'm currently reading another book by Professor Alan Taylor, author of The Civil War of 1812. My current read is The Internal Enemy, Slavery and War in Virginia, 1772 to 1832. I thought the book would be about slave rebellions, such as the one led by Nat Turner, but instead, its focus is on the War of 1812. According to Taylor, a key aspect of British strategy was to encourage slaves to escape and assist the British in their attacks against the Americans in exchange for their freedom. The British employed blacks as sailors, soldiers, as guides, and in other supporting roles, similar to their use of First Nations and Native warriors in Canada and in the Old Northwest. As a result, Americans living in Virginia and along the Atlantic coast feared the British as an external enemy and the slaves as an internal enemy. Hence the title of Taylor's book, which won the Pulitzer Prize for History in 2014. Admiral Cockburn disliked Americans and wanted to punish them for declaring war, but an attack against Lewis, Delaware on April 6th and 7th, a bombardment by HMS Poitiers, Captain Sir John Beresford, inflicts little damage, but a cannonball lodges in the foundation of the McCracken House, later called the Cannonball House, and now home to the Lewes Maritime Museum. The museum's website features the following information. Quote, on April the 5th, 2003, the Cannonball House was honored by the state of Delaware for its close association with the bombardment of Lewes by the British on April 6th and 7th, 1813, and as the home of two heroes of those fateful days, Gilbert McCracken and his son Henry, both pilots of the Bay and River Delaware. The War of 1812 Park across Front Street from the house and site of one of the two forts that defended Lewis during the bombardment was also recognized. Gilbert and Henry McCracken served in a volunteer militia composed primarily of Delaware pilots that defended Lewis until the end of the war in 1815. End of quote. A slightly different armed intervention is the American occupation of the Mobile district of West Florida, which had remained under Spanish rule in spite of American claims to the territory, Spain being a British ally. Major General James Wilkinson will sail from New Orleans to Mobile with a force of 600 men to enforce American annexation of the district in mid-April. We shall be hearing more about Major General James Wilkinson shortly, and in Canada too. I find the Florida situation during the War of 1812 extremely confusing, so if anyone listening can recommend any books or articles on this topic, please let me know in the comments below. As for Canada, April sees another invasion force on its way. Major General Henry Dearborn's initial target was Kingston, but he had heard it had been reinforced and was therefore too strong, so he shifts to a lesser target, York, which he will attack on April the 27th. I will cover the Battle of York in a separate video, and I promise to keep the Toronto jokes to a minimum. Stay tuned. The War of 1812. May 1813. The war thus far. May 1813. Spring and warmer weather, somewhat warmer weather, has returned, and the armies, American and British, are once again on the move. May opens with the siege of Fort Meigs. Fort Meigs, which is being built on a bluff on the east bank of the Maumee Rapids in Ohio, under the direction of Major General William Henry Harrison, the hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe. The fort is named in honor of Ohio Governor Return Meigs. Return Meigs. Return being an excellent name for an elected official. According to author Sandy Antell in his book, A Wampum Denied, Proctor's War of 1812, Harrison is intent on, quote, building an impregnable base as a springboard for subsequent operations, end of quote. Man, that's hard to say, impregnable. Oh, never mind. Over in Amherstburg, Upper Canada, Henry Proctor, an aggressive officer, determines on a preemptive strike in order to knock the fort out of commission. He cobbles together a force consisting of 423 regulars from the 41st Regiment of Foot, 63 from the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, 31 artillerymen and 16 other ranks, 462 militiamen, and finally 1,200 Shawnee, Potawatomi, Kickapoo, and Sac warriors under Tecumseh. This gives him, if my math is correct, a force of about 2,200 men, or 2,225 to be more specific. Proctor's force reaches the Maumee on April 23rd, but are unable to get their artillery into position until the 1st of May, when the bombardment begins. In the meantime, Harrison has his men construct 12-foot earthen barriers as shelter from the barrage, which, in the end, causes few casualties. The Americans are low on ammunition, however, so Harrison agrees to give his men a gill or 4 fingers, of whiskey for each spent cannonball they retrieve, the cannonballs then being fired back at the British. When an American relief column of 1,200 Kentucky volunteers under Brigadier General Green Clay approaches, Harrison determines to break up the siege with a 2-pronged attack. 800 men under Lieutenant Colonel William Dudley are to attack the British battery on the west bank of the Maumee, while Clay's 400 remaining men fight their way along the east bank to the fort. It should have worked. Should have. But once again, the Kentucky militiamen fall victim to their lack of discipline. Instead of halting once their objective had been achieved, Dudley's Kentuckians chase Proctor's native allies into the woods, where the warriors turn around and massacre them. Of 800 Kentucky militiamen, only 150 make it back to Fort Meigs. Amongst those killed is William Dudley. But in spite of the heavy American losses, Proctor and his allies are unable to take the fort, and so, after a final brief bombardment, the siege ends May the 9th. The results of this engagement might be considered inconclusive. While Proctor blocks yet another American offensive, preventing Harrison from attempting to link up with the American forces poised to invade the Niagara region, his inability to destroy the U.S. base of operations will come back to haunt him in the fall of 1813. British Admiral Sir George Cockburn doesn't like Americans, and as commander of a Royal Navy squadron, he is determined to punish them by a series of sea-borne raids in the Chesapeake Bay area, and vows to destroy any community that shows resistance. After occupying Spazooty Island, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Spazooty Island on April the 23rd, the British follow with a successful raid on Frenchtown on the Elk River on April the 29th. But, as the town of Havre de Grace, I love that name, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly too, Havre de Grace, Maryland, shows the American flag, and worse yet, takes pot shots at the British, Cockburn determines to attack it. As the town lay in an area of shallow water, the British send a flotilla of 16 or 19 boats, depending on your source, to effect an amphibious assault. The town is initially defended by Maryland militia, but after a civilian is killed by a Congreve rocket, they make a hasty departure. In fairness to them, most of these militiamen are apparently quite elderly. But one doughty individual, Second Lieutenant John O'Neill, fires an artillery piece, then a musket at the invading British, wounding their commander, Canadian-born George Augustus Westfall, a future Royal Navy admiral, who is shot in the hand. As O'Neill is Irish-born, Cockburn wants to have him shot as a British subject and therefore a traitor. But instead he decides to release him based on the intercession of, depending on your source again, O'Neill's 15-year-old daughter Matilda, or President Madison himself. Perhaps, as historian Alan Taylor suggests in The Internal Enemy, Slavery and War in Virginia, 1772 to 1832, the British released O'Neill, quote, rather than make a popular martyr out of a respectable man, end of quote. The British would burn 40 of the town's 60 houses and vandalize the Episcopal Church. But as Alan Taylor notes, there is a method behind Cockburn's brutality. The property of collaborators and anti-war Federalists is respected, while that of pro-war Republicans and those who resist the British is destroyed. Admiral Cockburn doesn't like Americans. In the end, they won't like him much either. After visiting Toronto, York, and then leaving, always a good plan, Henry Dearborn slowly sets his sights on the next objective, Fort George at Newark, Upper Canada, today's Niagara-on-the-Lake. The Americans arrive on May the 8th and land east of Fort Niagara, outside the range of British artillery. Quick statement of clarification. Fort Niagara is the American fort and lies on the east or New York side of the Niagara River. Fort George is the British/Canadian fort and lies on the west or Canadian side of the Niagara River. The ever-leisurely Dearborn thinks his men need rest. They probably do, and he wants even more troops to tackle the mere 1,000 regulars, 300 militia, and 100 native warriors commanded by his opponent, Brigadier General John Vincent. Dearborn will finally attack on May the 27th with another successful amphibious assault. The invading troops under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Winifred Scott, captured at Queenston Heights and recently paroled, but the British will claim he has broken his parole as he is not being officially exchanged. Vincent, like Sheaffe before him, determines to save his army and retreats from Fort George, making for Burlington Heights, some 60 miles to the west. He also evacuates the garrisons at Queenston, Chippewa, and Fort Erie. In spite of a broken collarbone received in action, Winifred Scott begins to pursue the retreating British, only to be halted by his superiors, Generals Morgan Lewis and John Boyd, who fear ambush by native warriors. Thus the Americans snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, and Vincent's army, like Sheaffe's at York, will live to fight another day. But as the Yanks are away, Sir George Prevost and Sir James Yeo, commander of the fleet on Lake Ontario, determine to attack the main American naval base at Sackett's Harbor, New York, while Commodore Isaac Chauncey and the U.S. fleet is off the Niagara River in support of the attack on Fort George. The attacking force is hastily thrown together, but Prevost manages to raise 870 troops. Departing from Kingston, Upper Canada on May the 27th, the British lose the element of surprise when they are sighted by 3 picket boats left on guard by Chauncey. Ashore, the harbor is defended by 500 U.S. regulars under Lieutenant Colonel Electus Backus. What a great name. Electus Backus, plus 900 militia under Brigadier General Jacob Brown of the New York Militia, with Brown being in overall command. Brown assumes the British will land at Horse Island, which is connected to the mainland by a partially submerged causeway, and arranges his defenses accordingly. Events unfold as Brown had predicted, and, in theory, he should have had the invaders pinned to the island. But when the British regulars begin to charge across the causeway, the militia takes to its heels, allowing them to gain the mainland. In intense fighting with the American regulars, who stand and fight, the British slowly breach the U.S. defenses. In the confusion, and believing the day lost, Acting Lieutenant John Drury, a young naval officer, executes the plan to burn the naval warehouses and the newly built warship General Pike to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. It is at this point that Sir George, concerned with the mounting casualties and not aware the Americans were setting fire to the naval yard, orders a general retreat, and, in spite of their incredulity, the British soldiers, being professionals, obey, and the flotilla sails back to Kingston. An American victory? When the defenders realize that the British are leaving, they rush to save the General Pike, but the warehouses, including all the booty taken at York, are totally destroyed. Historian Alan Taylor notes that Commodore Isaac Chauncey blames the army for both the attack and destruction, and determines to guard the harbor rather than support the invading American troops for the rest of the 1813 campaign, which allows British naval forces to harass them with impunity. Well, all that sounds more like a British victory to me. Alan Taylor thinks the clear winner of what Wikipedia calls the Second Battle of Sackett's Harbor is the ambitious Jacob Brown. As Lieutenant Colonel Backus is killed during the battle, Brown will write the after-action report, which will highlight his involvement, and which he parlays into a commission as a brigadier general in the regular U.S. Army. As for me, I think there is another loser, Sir George Prevost. Sir George was a brave man who had served gallantly in combat. But he is also an administrator, charged with conserving resources, such as the limited number of soldiers in Upper and Lower Canada. He would have been concerned by the high casualties suffered by the British side. Wikipedia lists 30 killed, 200 wounded, plus 30 wounded prisoners. Not knowing the Americans were on the verge of defeat, he probably decided to cut his losses. But his decision will start some people wondering if Sir George, who, like Sheaffe, was born in the United States, is a secret American sympathizer and just not up to the job of Governor-General of the Canadas and Commander-in-Chief in British North America. But what do you think, dear listeners? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. The War of 1812. The War Thus Far. June 1813. June 1813. We'll see a lot of fighting in the Canadian theater, but that's not all that happens. Once again, there is considerable action at sea. On June the 18th, the War of 1812 will be 1 year old. Somehow I don't think anyone will be celebrating. Two major battles will occur in June. The Battle of Stony Creek on June the 6th, followed by the Battle of Beaver Dams on June the 24th. I won't be talking about them in this video, but we'll discuss Stony Creek when I review Strange Fatality, The Battle of Stony Creek 1813 by James E. Elliott. And I will discuss Beaver Dams when I review The Battle of Beaver Dams, the story of Thorold's. I lived near there for 4 years, I can't pronounce it. The story of Thorold's battle in the War of 1812 by Donald Keith Dewar, a little booklet I picked up in my travels. On June the 1st, HMS Shannon will capture the USS Chesapeake, the ship which figured in the infamous Chesapeake Leopard affair of 1807, when the Royal Navy ship stopped the American vessel to search for deserters and open fire when they were refused. According to Wikipedia, the Chesapeake suffered 4 killed and 17 wounded, and were only able to fire 1 shot during the altercation. 4 sailors were taken prisoner by the British, with one, London-born Jenkyn Radford, hanged from the yardarm for mutiny, desertion, and contempt. The incident sparked considerable outrage in the U.S. and almost started the War of 1812 5 years early. The War of 1807, then. On May the 20th of 1812, command of the Chesapeake was taken over by Captain James Lawrence, who had led the USS Hornet in its victory over the Peacock. Lawrence found an unhappy crew. Many were leaving, their terms of enlistment over, while those that remained were angry that their prize money, earned from the capture of 6 British ships early in 1813, was being held up in court. Lawrence paid the crewmen out of his own pocket, which leads me to ask, why didn't I ever have a boss like that? Should have joined the Navy, I guess. Instead, I joined the library. Blockading Boston was HMS Shannon, under the command of Captain Philip Broke, who had been in charge since 1806. Broke ran a tight ship and drilled his veteran crew in gunnery on a daily basis, while Lawrence, on the other hand, had a basically new crew, not used to working together, which will lead to ominous results. In one of those niceties peculiar to the War of 1812, Broke sent Lawrence a note requesting a fight. A very polite note. Alas, Lawrence will never receive it, for he had already put to sea, leading the Chesapeake to its rendezvous with fate. The ships would meet at 5 on the afternoon of the 1st, and in 6 minutes both managed to fire 2 broadsides, where the superior British gunnery gave them the decisive edge. The Chesapeake's wheel was shot away, and unable to maneuver, it crashed into the Shannon. Captain Lawrence attempted to organize a boarding party, only to be shot by a sniper. his last order before being taken below, has gone down in history as, quote, "Don't give up the ship. Fight her till she sinks." End of quote. Broke led a landing party aboard the Chesapeake and was able to capture the American vessel within 15 minutes. But he was seriously wounded when struck over the head with a sword. In spite of his injuries, Broke had the Chesapeake repaired and sailed to Halifax, where it was pressed into service with the Royal Navy, Lawrence dying en route to Nova Scotia. As statistics may vary, I've decided to go with the casualty figures from the USS Constitution Museum. British, 23 killed, 56 wounded. American, 48 killed, 99 wounded, including Captain James Lawrence, mortally wounded. The USS Growler was part of the Lake Champlain Squadron. It was a 112-ton sloop of war, which boasted an armament of 10 18-pound guns, plus one 6-pounder. But on June 3, 1813, it and USS Eagle were captured by British soldiers from the 100th Regiment of Foot, Prince Regent's County of Dublin Regiment. This action occurred close to the Ile aux Noix on the Richelieu River, following a 3.5-hour firefight in which 3 British soldiers were wounded, with 1 American killed, along with 8 wounded. Both the Growler and the Eagle will be taken into service by the Royal Navy, only to be recaptured by the Americans in 1814. On June 22nd, British forces under Sir George Cockburn attacked the fortifications on Cranny Island. Cranny Island, C-R-A-N-E-Y. Cranny Island, near Norfolk and Portsmouth, Virginia, where, according to historian Alan Taylor, writing in The Internal Enemy, War and Slavery in Virginia, 1772 to 1832, the Americans had built a battery and kept their gunboats. The British dispatched 50 landing barges with troops to capture the island, but American fire sank 2 and drove the rest away. Experiencing heavy casualties, the British will accuse the U.S. of massacring 30 troops from the Independent Company of Foreigners, a British regiment made up of French POWs from the Napoleonic Wars, a charge the Americans hotly deny. The British followed up their attack on Cranny Island with a June 25th raid on Hampton, Virginia, starting with a morning bombardment, followed by the landing of 900 troops. The 500 American defenders threw their arms away and ran. To revenge the alleged massacre, the angry French troops then ransacked the town, committing rapes and, according to Alan Taylor, murdering an old man named Kirby in his bed. British officers tried to restrain the troops with no success, and, as an added insult, 30 of the French mercenaries deserted to join the Americans. The Americans had suffered a military defeat, but gained a propaganda victory that, in Taylor's words, allowed them to refute, quote, British claims to superior civility, end of quote. Finally, on June 27th, Wikipedia states that the American privateer Pxhere, Teazer, Teazer, is blown up in Mahone Bay, Nova Scotia. Mahone Bay, Nova Scotia. Except it wasn't the teaser, which had actually been captured and burned by HMS San Domingo on January the 17th, 1813. This ship was the young teaser, which had been built as a replacement vessel and which is described by the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic as, quote, a remarkably fast private schooner. She took many prizes off Nova Scotia, including several right at the mouth of Halifax Harbor. End of quote. Cornered in Mahone Bay, the ship was purposely blown up by Lieutenant Frederick Johnson, who had been an officer on the original teaser and had been released, but who had broken his parole, i.e., he had promised not to return to action until exchanged for a British prisoner of similar rank. Only around 7 of the crew survived the explosion, with the number of those killed estimated from 28 to 32. Thus, the month of June 1813 went out with a bang. The column Heroes and Villains in the May-June 2023 issue of Legion magazine features the commanders of the Shannon and the Chesapeake, Philip Broke and James Lawrence. As it's a Canadian magazine, I guess Lawrence is the villain. In one of the great ironies in this most ironic war, Lawrence, one of America's greatest naval heroes, was initially buried in Halifax, Nova Scotia, his body being eventually returned to the U.S. But the dead crewmen of both the Chesapeake and the Shannon remain, buried in the appropriately named Dead Man's Island off Halifax Harbor, which I guess makes the American dead now permanent residents. The War of 1812. July 1813. The war thus far. The 4th of July 1813 was probably not a happy one in the United States of America, and under cover of darkness, a small group of British and Canadian troops are about to make it unhappier still. During the early morning hours of July the 5th, 41 men, 34 Canadian militia, and 7 regulars from the 49th Regiment under Lieutenant James Fitzgibbons slip across the Niagara River and attack Fort Schlosser. Fort Schlosser. Always have trouble saying that one. Fort Schlosser, an old British fort located in present-day Niagara Falls, New York. The raiders capture the 11 men guarding the fort, as well as, quote, a 6-pound brass cannon, 57 muskets, 1.5 kegs of musket balls, 3 boats, 20 barrels of salt, 8 kegs of tobacco, and 16 tons of cannon shot. End of quote. What, no whiskey? My source? Wikipedia. Crossing the Niagara River, the British/Canadians are fired on by some American militia, but no one is hit. Following defeats at Stony Creek and at Beaver Dams, the U.S. Army has been reduced to hiding out in Fort George, which they captured back in May. There, the Americans find themselves continually harassed by the British, the Canadians, and their First Nations allies. Among the harassing actions are the Battle of Ball's Farm on July the 8th, where a mixed British, Canadian, and First Nations force under William Hamilton Merritt attempted to recover some medical supplies which had been buried on the Choros farm near Fort George during the retreat following the American invasion on May the 27th. A first attempt fails, but the second, on the morning of the 8th, succeeds, the native warriors lurking in nearby woods to watch over their allies. The warriors attracted the attention of the Americans, who dispatch a force of 500 men to drive them off, the natives falling back further into the woods. A body of 40 U.S. troops attempting to flank the warriors stumble into them instead and suffered 20 killed with 13 soldiers captured. In his book, The Flames of War, The Fight for Upper Canada, July to December 1813, Richard Feltow reports a second skirmish in the same area on July the 17th, when, according to the words of one participant, Lieutenant T.G. Rideau of the 3rd York Militia, quote, "A good many Yankees were killed." End of quote. A further action occurs July 11th, when Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Bishop led 240 British and Canadian troops across the Niagara River to Black Rock, now part of the city of Buffalo, New York. The defenders, 150 militiamen under Major Parmenio Adams. Parmenio Adams, gosh, what a great name. Parmenio Adams fled into the night, allowing the British to capture nearby Fort Gibson, where they spiked the artillery and seize some other cannon, as well as muskets, ammunition, clothing, food, and boats, before setting fire to blockhouses, barracks, the Navy Yard, and a schooner. Returning to the Canadian side, the British are ambushed by a mixed force of 230 men under Brigadier General Peter B. Porter of the New York Militia. While the British escape with their plunder, they suffer significant casualties. 3 killed, including Lieutenant Colonel Bishop, 24 wounded, and 17 men taken prisoner. American losses are 3 killed, 6 wounded. According to Wikipedia, quote, "The British withdrawal was unduly delayed to secure several hundred prized bags of salt." End of quote. In spite of the loss of Lieutenant Colonel Bishop, the British are the clear victors, and are the clear victors in having entrapped the Americans in Fort George while they roam the country at will. Sometime in early July, Wikipedia gives the date as July the 8th, the final siege of Fort Madison, Iowa begins. Who is besieged? The U.S. Army. Who is attacking the fort? The Sauk and other tribes under the leadership of the famous chief Black Hawk. In the end, the army will abandon the fort sometime in September. Wikipedia says this was the only battle in the War of 1812 to take place west of the Mississippi. Is that really true? You tell me, dear listeners, in the comments. Staying in the U.S., Wikipedia's timeline of the War of 1812 states that on July the 26th, British forces under Henry Proctor will abandon their siege of Fort Meigs on the Maumee River near present-day Perrysburg, Ohio. The fort, which had been built as a strong base of operations by William Henry Harrison, is named in honor of Ohio Governor Return Meigs. Return Meigs. Seriously, this is the second siege of the fort. During the initial attempt, the British had been unable to force the Americans to surrender, but did manage to inflict enormous casualties when Kentucky militia, part of a relief force, fell into an ambush by native warriors. Please see my May 1813 video for more information. This time, the British and their native allies attempt to lure the Americans from their stronghold by staging a mock battle meant to sound like an attack on a U.S. relief column. But the defenders see through the ploy and refuse to play, so the invaders have no choice but to give up and take their ball home. And their cannonballs, too. Moving south, July the 27th, we'll see what goes down in history as the Battle of Burnt Corn, a.k.a. the Battle of Burnt Corn Creek, which pitted the United States against the Creek Indians and is part of what is known as the Creek War. This action will take place at, you guessed it, Burnt Corn Creek, which is situated in the southern part of present-day Alabama. The details of the Creek Wars are outside the scope of this video and will be the subject of a future upload. But, similar to American attempts to expand into Canada, the U.S. will also attempt to seize land from Native Americans in the southeast, as well as drive the Spanish, British allies, from Florida. In this particular action, U.S. troops would surprise a party of Red Sticks, Creek traditionalists, opposed to the Americans who were returning from Florida, where they had purchased ammunition. The soldiers surprised the Red Sticks as they were bedding down for the night, forcing them to hide in some nearby swamps. The Red Sticks would have the last laugh, however. Seeing the Americans were busy looting their pack horses, they counterattacked, chasing them into the night. Both sides would experience a similar number of casualties. Creek warriors, 10 to 12 killed, 8 to 9 wounded. Americans, 2 killed, 15 wounded. July will end with a bang. Or is it a whimper? According to British historian John Latimer, on the 30th, a British force of around 1,000 men will raid Plattsburgh, New York, where New York militia general Benjamin Moores, not to be confused with the paint people, assembles a 6-pounder and 300 men. 300 men who run away when the enemy lands. The British will destroy the arsenal, a blockhouse, and seize commissary stores before returning home. Month's End also sees the second American visit to York. On July the 27th, an American attack force leaves the Niagara by ship and sails east along Lake Ontario to raid the British supply depot at Burlington Heights. Hampered by what author Richard Felto describes as adverse winds, the Americans arrive to find the position heavily reinforced by units such as the Glengarry Light Infantry, which has marched all the way from York. The American commander, Winfield Scott, I keep thinking I've been referring to him in some of my earlier videos as Winifred Scott. It's not Winifred Scott, it's Winfield Scott. The American commander, Winfield Scott, who is generally an aggressive officer, doesn't like the odds, so the fleet sails off to York instead, which is undefended. The Glengarrys, being at Burlington Heights, and the militia available in town, being on parole. Parole, i.e., being unable to take up arms until exchanged for an American POW. The invaders take away some military stores and destroy some private property before making a quick departure. I guess they didn't try to fly out of Toronto Airport. Thus, July sees action in Canada, the Deep South, and the Old Northwest. The Americans find themselves imprisoned in Fort George while the British and their native and Canadian allies roam free to harass them and send raiding parties across the Niagara River into the United States. It is a month of skirmishes and hit-and-run attacks. But in each of these actions, people are killed or maimed and private property destroyed. This is a truth we should never forget. The War of 1812. August 1813. The war thus far. In late July, after their failure to take Fort Meigs, please see my July 1813 video, a British and native force under Henry Proctor sailed east to attack an American supply depot guarded by Fort Stephenson on Ohio's Sandusky River. William Henry Harrison, commander of the Army of the Northwest, believes Proctor's force to be larger than it is in reality and orders Major George Croghan, in command at Fort Stephenson, to destroy the fort and retreat. But Croghan convinces Harrison to let him stand and fight. Croghan has 160 men. 160. Proctor has a much larger force of 500 British regulars and 2,800 native warriors under Tecumseh and Robert Dixon. The British begin with an artillery barrage, with Croghan having but one cannon, Old Betsy, with which to reply. But the Wikipedia article on the battle says that Croghan keeps changing Old Betsy's position so that Proctor will think he has more guns than he actually has. Still, running low on ammunition, Croghan orders his men to cease firing in order to conserve cannonballs. Cannonballs! Croghan determines that the British will assault the fort's northwest corner, and so conceals Old Betsy in a nearby blockhouse to await their arrival. And when they attack, Old Betsy fires at them at point-blank range, inflicting such serious casualties on the British regulars that Proctor decides to call off the siege. Wikipedia lists the casualty figures as British/native warriors, 26 killed, 41 wounded, 29 missing in action. American, 1 killed, 7 wounded. Proctor's failure to take either Fort Meigs or Fort Stephenson drives a wedge between him and his native allies, especially Tecumseh, and will eventually end in a successful American invasion of Upper Canada in the fall. On August the 5th, the U.S. privateer Decatur, the largest American privateer out of Charleston, South Carolina, and named in honor of Commodore Stephen Decatur, captures HMS Dominica off Bermuda. Both vessels were schooners. According to Wikipedia, the Dominica was better armed, but the Decatur was better manned, with the Americans boarding the British schooner after a long engagement. British losses were 18 killed, including the Dominica's captain, George Wilmot Barrett, with 70 captured, 40 of them wounded. American losses were 5 killed and 15 wounded. The captain of the Decatur was Dominique Durand. The Decatur itself will be captured by the Royal Navy in 1814. On August the 8th, 2 American schooners, the USS Hamilton, named in honor of former Secretary of the Navy Paul Hamilton, and the USS Scourge, both founder during a severe squall off 12 Mile Creek, near, strangely enough, Hamilton, Ontario. Over 80 seamen are lost, with only 16 survivors. In 1976, the sunken ships were declared a National Historic Site of Canada, with the city of Hamilton formally claiming the wrecks in 1979. The Wikipedia timeline for the War of 1812 says that on August 10th, the ships Julia and Pert were captured. Huh? What? Here's what really happened. Again, from Wikipedia. Quote, on the night of 7 to 8 August, Julia rescued a number of survivors of Scourge after that schooner had capsized and sunk in a heavy gale off 12 Mile Creek. During the next 3 days, the American flotilla and the British squadron maneuvered, seeking to move into an advantageous position for a general engagement. On 10th August, Julia and Growler were cut off from the flotilla after their commanders executed an incorrect turn and were captured. Hamilton and Scourge will be recaptured in October near the beautifully named False Duck Islands in eastern Lake Ontario off Prince Edward County. Sticking at sea, on August the 12th, USS Argus, a veteran of the First Barbary War, is captured by HMS Pelican off St. David's Head in Wales, UK. Huh. Seems like the War of 1812 was something of a world war. After an intense fight in which the American Commandant William Henry Allen lost a leg, the Argus surrendered and was taken to Plymouth, England, where Allen died of his wounds. The rest of the crew were held as POWs for the duration of the war. The website, 1812privateers.org, quoting William James, no relation, William James's The Naval History of Great Britain from the Declaration of War by France in 1793 to the accession of George IV. Wow, now there's a title for you. Provides the following casualty figures regarding the Pelican. Quote, out of her 101 men, her second lieutenant among the absent, and 12 boys, the Pelican lost, besides the master's mate, William Young, slain in the moment of victory, 1 seaman killed, and 5 slightly wounded, chiefly by the American musketry and Langridge, the latter to the torture of the wounded. End of quote. With regards to the Argus, quote, out of her 122 men and 3 boys, to appearance a remarkably fine ship's company, the Argus had 6 seamen killed, her commander, 2 midshipmen, the carpenter, and 3 seamen mortally, her first lieutenant and 5 seamen severely, and 8 others slightly wounded. Total, 6 killed and 18 wounded. End of quote. Finally, August ends way down south with another chapter of the Creek War. The Creek War, the Fort Mims Massacre. Fort Mims was a stockade with a blockhouse located near Bay Minette, Alabama. On the 30th, the fort was overrun by 1,000 Red Stick warriors under the command of Peter McQueen and William Weatherford. The Red Sticks were Creek Indian traditionalists. Opposed to American expansion into their territory, which is in modern-day Alabama, Georgia, and northern Florida. Some 265 American militia are killed or captured, with 252 civilians suffering a similar fate. The fort itself was severely damaged. This action is part of the Creek War, a related conflict to the War of 1812. So August sees the British retreating from Ohio, the massacre at Fort Mims in Alabama, and plenty of action on the Great Lakes and the high seas. With Henry Proctor in Tecumseh on retreat, will William Henry Harrison go on the offensive? Stay tuned. The War of 1812. September and October 1813. The war thus far. In early September, the British garrison at Fort Malden, near present-day Amherstburg, Ontario, was in dire straits. Basically, they were starving. As the Americans controlled Lake Erie, nothing could get through. Thus, the British commander, Major General Henry Proctor, urged Royal Navy Commander Robert Barclay to engage the American squadron in order to reopen the supply lines. Although facing a critical lack of seamen to operate his vessels, Barclay weighed anchor at 3 p.m. on September 9th in order to seek combat. The ships under his command were Detroit, Queen Charlotte, Lady Prevost, General Hunter, Little Bolt, and Chippewa. On the afternoon of the 10th, the British would engage the Americans off their anchorage at Put-in Bay, Ohio. Put-in Bay, Ohio. The American squadron consisted of the Lawrence, Niagara, Caledonia, Ariel, Somers, Somers, Scorpion, Porcupine, Tigris, and Trippe, Trippe, under the command of Master Commandant Oliver Hazard Perry. Thus, the British were outnumbered in ships, in experienced crew, and in firepower. Nevertheless, Barclay's ships did far better than might have been expected, disabling the American flagship Lawrence and forcing Perry to shift his command to the Niagara. But in spite of this early success, numbers count, and the Americans ultimately prevailed. The destruction of the British squadron will open the door for the American invasion of Upper Canada and force Proctor and his ally Tecumseh to retreat. On September 25th, the British brig of war HMS Boxer was captured by the American brig of war USS Enterprise after a 45-minute fight in which the British commander, Samuel Blythe, was killed. An 18-pound cannonball tore off his left arm and spilled his intestines all over the deck, while his American counterpart, Lieutenant William Burroughs, died a more lingering death after being hit in the thigh by a musket ball. The American victory may have been the result of better discipline. The crew of the Enterprise were well trained, while Blythe, although a brave officer, seemed more concerned with prize money and financial gain than in running a tight ship. In one of those ironies peculiar to this war, both captains were given an elaborate funeral in Portland, Maine, an event attended by both crews and by everybody in the surrounding vicinity. The triumph of the Enterprise was a great propaganda victory for the American side, but did nothing to change the total blockade of the U.S. seaboard by the Royal Navy. On September 28th occurs the naval engagement that has gone down in history as the Burlington Races. Most accounts give the impression that the American squadron under Isaac Chauncey chased the British under Sir James Yeo up and down Lake Ontario. But this was a serious military engagement, not a sporting event. The issue, as explained by the late Robert Malcolmson in his book Lords of the Lake, The Naval War on Lake Ontario, 1812 to 1814, lay in the way the opposing ships were armed. British vessels under Yeo had to get within close range for their fire to be effective, while the Americans under Chauncey could batter their opponents at long range. Thus, what looked like a race or chase from the shore was the attempt by both squadrons to get into a position that would maximize their firepower. Still, in this engagement, Chauncey may have given more than he received, damaging Yeo's flagship, the Wolf. But bad weather forced the Americans to break off. This will not be a decisive action like the Battle of Lake Erie, and the Wolf and Yeo will live to fight another day. According to Wikipedia, on September 26, quote, General William Henry Harrison lands in Canada, Detroit liberated, end of quote. But according to author Sandy Antell, writing in A Wampum Denied, Proctor's War of 1812, Harrison actually lands at Bar Point, 3 miles south of Emmitsburg, at 3 p.m. on September 27th. In any event, Detroit is liberated, and Proctor and his native allies are forced to retreat eastwards, where they will eventually make a stand at Moravian Town on the River Thames, near present-day Thamesville, Ontario, at 4 p.m. on October the 5th. Proctor is outnumbered 3-1, and a charge by mounted Kentucky militia caused British resistance to collapse. Tecumseh is killed, and Proctor narrowly avoids capture. But he will not be able to avoid censure for his role in what has become known as the Battle of the Thames. According to Wikipedia, a court-martial will find Proctor guilty in 1815 of managing the retreat badly, failing to secure stores, and poor troop disposition at the Battle of the Thames, effectively ending his career. Commander Robert Barclay will also face a court-martial for the loss of his squadron at Lake Erie, but in his case, the badly maimed sailor, He'd already lost an arm prior to the Battle of Lake Erie, and he received further injuries during that battle. In his case, the badly maimed sailor will be acquitted. In his book, A Wampum Denied, Proctor's War of 1812, author Sandy Antal makes a compelling case that both Proctor and Barclay were badly neglected in terms of men and supplies by their superiors, Sir George Prevost, Sir James Yeo, and Baron de Rottenburg, all of whom largely escaped blame for the defeats. Thus, September and October see the British on the sharp receiving end of American aggression, but the fortunes of war are always in flux. On October 26, a force of 1,530 men, 1,530 men, under Charles de Salaberry, a French-Canadian officer in the British Army, defeats a force of 2,600 American regulars under Major General Wayne Hampton, whose forces are part of a two-pronged invasion meant to capture Montreal. While the victory was not as one-sided as it has gone down in Canadian folklore, where 300 Canucks supposedly beat 7,500 Yanks, the reversal was enough to convince Hampton to give up and go home, which he does. But what happened to the other American prong, a force of 8,000 under Major General James Wilkinson? Stay tuned. Thus, September and October 1813 see a series of United States victories on both land and water, culminating in a serious defeat, which leads an American army to give up. The War of 1812. November 1813. The war thus far. In November of 1813, the main action on the Northern Front is the attempt by an American army of 8,000 men to move down the St. Lawrence River for an assault on Montreal, an invasion which will culminate in the famous, or infamous, Battle of Chrysler's Farm on November the 11th. I will not be covering the battle in today's video, but will do so shortly when I review Donald E. Graves' account, Field of Glory. But for right now, let's just say that this engagement did not provide much glory for the U.S. Army. But what else happened in the war during November 1813? Most of the action took place in the southern U.S. as part of the Red Stick War, which saw members of the Creek Nation fighting American expansion into their lands, as well as the end of a Patriot Army which had tried to seize the Spanish territory of Florida, conflicts of which I know very little. But on November 13th, a skirmish will take place at the cabin of John Dunham near Nanticoke Creek in southwest Upper Canada, today's southwest Ontario, which will have profound legal consequences. After receiving a report that a number of anti-British marauders were assembled at the cabin of the American sympathizer Dunham, militia from Oxford and Norfolk, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Henry Boswick, surrounded the property. Captain John Boswick, no relation to the Lieutenant Colonel, as far as I know, and Lieutenant Austin entered the house to demand the marauders' surrender, only to have them shoot Boswick in the face twice, slightly wounding him. The militia then stormed the cabin, and in the ensuing firefight, 3 robbers were killed, 2 to 3 wounded, and 18 captured, some of whom will be hanged at Burlington's Bloody Assize on July the 20th, 1814. But what happened down south? The Creek War is linked to the War of 1812 and was a conflict between the United States and those members of the Creek Nation, known as the Red Sticks, who were actively resisting American encroachment of their traditional lands. It is in this conflict that Andrew Jackson, general and future president, will win his spurs. November 3rd sees the Battle of Tallusahatchee, which occurs when Jackson learns of a large force of Red Sticks at a town 8 miles northeast of his supply base at Fort Strother on Mississippi's Coosa River. Jackson dispatches 900 mounted troops under Brigadier General John Coffee, who encircle the town and, after an intense struggle, burn it down. 186 Red Sticks are killed, while 84 native women and children are taken captive. The Americans lose 5 dead and 41 wounded. Among the American combatants that day was one Davy Crockett. This was followed on November 9th by the Battle of Talladega. Jackson, hearing that Fort Leslie, an Allied defensive position at Talladega, was besieged by 1,000 Red Stick warriors, led a force of 1,200 infantry and 800 cavalry and enveloped the town. That's envelop the town. In the ensuing battle, 290 Red Sticks were killed, but over 700 escape through gaps in the American lines. Jackson loses 15 men, with 85 wounded. It will be Jackson's last campaign of 1813. November 12th sees a naval battle that will be known to history as the Canoe Fight. Captain Sam Dale, the Daniel Boone of Alabama, leaves Fort Madison on a search and destroy mission in the southern part of the Mississippi Territory. On the Alabama River, Dale's men are attacked by a large body of Creek warriors and were trying to retreat across the river when they saw a boat containing 11 Red Stick warriors coming to join the fight. Dale and 3 companions leapt into a canoe and engaged the boat, wiping out the Red Sticks despite being outnumbered. This was a rather minor skirmish, but as news of American victories were in short supply, it was conflated into a stirring national triumph. Tragically, what goes down in history as the Battle of the Hillabys occurs November the 18th. The Hillabys were a sub-tribe of the Creeks and had sued for peace. Andrew Jackson agreed, but the news failed to reach the East Tennessee militia, who attacked and burned the village. Andrew Jackson was largely blamed for this tragedy and was accused of betraying a sacred trust. The Creek War ends November on the 29th with the Battle of the Otossee. Over 1,200 Georgia militia and native allies under General John Floyd leave Fort Mitchell and march 60 miles to the creek town of Otossee, where there are 1,000 Red Sticks in residence. Floyd attempts to envelop the town, but is surprised when he discovers a second Red Stick camp 500 yards from the village, which causes him to rearrange his forces. But, due to gaps in the American lines, many warriors were able to escape. But still, some 200 were killed, while Floyd lost 11 dead with 54 wounded. Finally, the last act of the Patriot War, an attempt by a group of American patriots to seize Florida from Spain, transpires on November 22nd, when Spanish troops, complete with artillery, attack the Zephaniah Kingsley plantation at Laurel Grove, forcing some 70 patriots, who had been using the house as a headquarters, to flee into the woods. The plantation house is then burned to the ground with the assistance of Kingsley's wife, Anna J. J-A-I, a former slave. To which I say, wow, just wow. In the future, the United States will acquire this territory through negotiations, and it will become the state known as Florida. I have only a limited understanding of the Patriot War and what causes it, but I hope to cover it in much more detail in the future. Thus, November 1813 sees the famous, or infamous, Battle of Chrysler's Farm, which derails an American invasion of Canada, a series of battles and skirmishes in the Creek War, and the end of an attempt by American patriots to annex Florida. The information in today's video was derived almost exclusively from D.R. Westhouse's masterful, but sadly unpublished, The War of 1812, a chronology of the military actions 1812 to 1815. But any mistakes in this video are strictly my own. I acquired this amazing resource when I purchased Mr. Westhouse's collection of War of 1812 books. 72 of them, and I sure wish I'd had it when I had started this channel. The War of 1812, December 1813, the war thus far. Today's video will be largely based on the entries in my treasure, the unpublished The War of 1812, a chronology of the military actions 1812 to 1815 by D.R. Westhouse. But, as always, any errors are strictly my own. In the 1800s, warfare was generally a summertime activity, but not always. In spite of the cold and the rain and snow in the Canadas and the northern U.S., a lot of action still transpired during the winter months, and December 1813 was no exception. December 10th sees the burning of Newark, Upper Canada, present-day Niagara-on-the-Lake, Ontario. An American force, New York Militia, under Brigadier General George McClure, has been trapped inside Fort George and decide to abandon and burn it before crossing the narrow Niagara River for home. But McClure also determined to burn the village of Newark to supposedly keep the British troops from using it as a base. While my primary source, the Chronology by D.R. Westhouse, doesn't mention it, the arch-Canadian traitor Joseph Wilkes is often accused of instigating the burning as an act of personal vengeance. Be that as it may, the inhabitants of Newark were driven from their homes in only their night clothes on a frigid winter's evening as the town burned, while Fort George itself was hardly damaged. Vengeance is swift. On December 19th, British and Canadian forces cross the Niagara River and capture Fort Niagara before burning the towns of Lewiston, Youngstown, Manchester, present-day Niagara Falls, and Tuscarora, as well as Fort Schlosser. Fort Schlosser. Then, on December the 30th, both Black Rock and Buffalo are destroyed by fire, as someday Washington itself will be burned. Mutually assured destruction. But when did this warfare by arson begin? Was it a carryover from the American Revolutionary War or from earlier conflicts? If anyone knows, please share your knowledge in the comments. But what else is happening beyond the Niagara frontier? Staying in Upper Canada, on December the 15th, near Moravia Town, Norfolk, Middlesex, and Kent militia, plus provincial dragoons, under the command of Lieutenants Henry Metcalfe and John McGregor, surround the home of Thomas McCrae, a captain in the 1st Kent Militia. McCrae's house has been occupied by a small party of Americans from the 26th U.S. Infantry under a Lieutenant Larwell, who are using it as a base to seize supplies and to demand pledges of loyalty from the local farmers. The militia storm the house, and in the ensuing struggle, 1 American is killed and 3 wounded, the survivors being taken as prisoners to Dover. According to Wikipedia, this is the only time that U.S. regulars are defeated by a force consisting only of Canadian militia. December 27th sees a different sort of cross-border raid when a British force of Frontier Light Infantry under the command of Captain Oliver Barker leave Stansted, Quebec to raid Derby, Vermont, where they seize supplies and burn down the local volunteer barracks. Way over on the Pacific coast, Fort Astoria in the Oregon Territory is visited by the British sloop of war HMS Raccoon, which has come to claim it for Britain, only to learn the American Pacific Fur Company had sold it to the British-owned Northwest Fur Trading Company in order to elude capture by the Royal Navy. The Raccoon's captain, William Black, is annoyed, having lost his prize money, and renames the post Fort George in honor of the King. The fort will remain in British hands until 1818, but the fighting over control of the Oregon Territory will go on much longer. What's the latest in the Creek War down south? On December 22nd, a force of 850 men under General Ferdinand Lee Claiborne, militia, regulars from the 3rd U.S. Infantry, plus 150 Choctaw warriors, arrived some 10 miles south of Econochaca, or the Holy Ground, situated on the bluffs above the Alabama River. The area was named the Holy Ground as the Creek Red Stick prophet Josiah Francis claimed it was a barrier the Americans couldn't cross. On December 23rd, the Americans crossed it. This caused many of the Creek warriors to flee, leaving Red Stick leader William Weatherford, a.k.a. Red Eagle, with only 120 fighters, which included some former slaves. They resisted for about an hour, but marshy terrain prevented the 1st Mississippi Volunteers from surrounding the village, allowing many warriors to slip away, including Weatherford, who rides his horse down the bluff and across the Alabama River to safety. Some 20 to 30 Red Sticks are killed, as well as some of the slaves. The Americans suffer 1 dead with 20 wounded. The village is burned, naturally, and Claiborne retires, as most of his men are coming to the end of their enlistment period. The Battle of the Holy Ground will be Claiborne's last appearance in the war, and he will die on March the 22nd, 1815, aged 45. As Wikipedia notes, Claiborne's campaign clears the Alabama River of Red Stick warriors, forcing them eastwards, where they will encounter Andrew Jackson. Thus, December 1813 sees a skirmish in southwest Upper Canada, a cross-border raid in Vermont, and American fur traders outwitting the Royal Navy, while, down south, the Red Stick warriors are driven from the protection of their holy ground, and in the Niagara, everything is burning, 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 fire and ice, or, to quote Pierre Burton, there are flames across the border. When did burning down the house become standard operating procedure? When will it all end? If this is your first visit to my channel, your first visit to 1812 channel, my name is Warren and I'm your host. I'm not a historian, nor am I an expert on the War of 1812. Instead, I'm a student wishing to learn about the conflict. Each month for the roughly 3 years of the war, I will outline the major events. I will also try to review a book on the war. Did I miss anything today? Any errors? Then let me know in the comments below. And when the barrage lifts, cheers! Pictures used in today's video were courtesy of Pxhere, that's Pxhere, while the music was The Prior, by that patron of the internet, Kevin MacLeod.